Good morning, everyone, and good evening to Dr. Derber. Welcome to today's talk on Who Owns Democracy and the Planet. My name is Qianyi Liu. I'm a research fellow here at the Institute of European and American Studies. Today's talk is sponsored by Farm for Change of our institute. Farm for Change is an interdisciplinary idea lab on climate change and broader environmental issues. We invite people whose ideas we think are inspiring and likely to instigate real changes. We are very honored to have Dr. Charles Derber as our speaker today. Dr. Derber is a professor of sociology at Boston College. His work focuses on the crisis of capitalism, globalization, corporate power, neo-fascism, American militarism, the culture of hegemony, the climate crisis, and the new peace and global justice movements. He is a very prolific author, having published about 40 books, translated into at least 14 languages, with several best-selling books and some widely used texts in American sociology. Dr. Derber's publication is a very important collection on the change of American society over time and the way that change has pushed the whole world to a terrible situation that we are in today. His work critiques how corporations have penetrated and controlled every aspect of our lives and reminds us how the marriage of political and economic power could degrade into fascism. At a time when we as a species are literally running out of time due to environmental crisis and militarism, it is particularly important to have public sociologists like Dr. Derber, who not only offer sociological critiques and alternative visions, but are also activists themselves. Believing in the importance of melding critical scholarship with social justice activism, Dr. Derber has brought together leaders of unions and many social justice movements to find solutions together. Today's talk will be based on Dr. Derber's two most recent books. In 2023, he co-authored and published the book Dying for Capitalism: How Big Money is Fueling Our Extinction and what we can do about it. His latest book, Who Owns Democracy? The Real Deep State and the Struggle Over Class and Caste in America, co-written with another sociologist, will come out next month. I'm sure we are all very anxious to learn more about our own extinction and if and how we can prevent it. So without further ado, let's welcome Dr. Charles Derber. Dr. Derber?
Yes. Thank you very much for inviting me and for that very generous introduction. It's one of the nicest introductions, one of the most accurate, I think, that I've had. And I really appreciate your inviting me to share some ideas and have a conversation with you about these incredibly dangerous multiple crises that we're confronting. So I think what I'd like to do is maybe talk for half an hour roughly about two issues. The first is a theme that I develop in the book that Qianyi mentioned called Dying for Capitalism, which is an analysis of the crisis of extinction that now confronts us and is, the most urgent threat humanity has, I think, ever faced. And in that book, I analyze that crisis in terms of what I call the extinction triangle. And I think you may have a visual. Yeah, there it is in rough form, taken from a page in the book. And this is a sort of visual way of sort of mapping out the structural forces that I view as sort of catalyzing and propelling the world toward extinction. So I want to talk about this triangle, which will probably be somewhat familiar to many of you, but I want to clarify what I mean to do with this triangle and how it operates as a threat to the survival of the planet. And then I want to shift on toward the question of what we can do about this by looking at the current political environment in the United States in particular, but in Europe and the world as a whole, because this is a global crisis, which has been produced by global actors and can only be in particularly global corporations and a kind of expanding global capitalist order. And it can therefore only be solved by the global international community, which is a challenging task because the world has been run for so many centuries by the very capitalist powers that are responsible for the crises that are pictured in this extinction of the triangle of extinction. So let me start with the triangle of extinction. And by the way, I'll look forward to a conversation with you about this. I won't go into too much depth. Many of you are very familiar, I think, with some of particularly the climate change crisis that this triangle highlights as a major part of the triangle of extinction. So let me start with, you'll note that the triangle sort of links causally three major systemic crises. One is capitalism, a system that's I view as at the center of the extinction crisis in the United States, because capitalist elites have secured such powerful control over governments around the world by the expansion of both military and financial power and investment. And what the triangle is picturing is the interaction between the causal ways in which capitalism is fueling both environmental destruction, which is of course, with climate change as arguably the most important, but hardly the only major crisis, existential crisis that is part of environmental destruction and the crisis of the death of the environment, the killing of the environment. And the triangle also highlights war and militarism in an age of globalism and, weapons of mass destruction, which also threaten the survival of the planet. So this is not a happy picture to look at, because what it's showing is that we have a incredibly powerful global economic system and set of elites based in large global capitalism, finance, and global corporations. And their operation, it's what I try to show in this book, Dying for Capitalism, is at the center of both the existential threat of environmental death and climate change, and of military destruction and the potential of nuclear and other kinds of wars of weapons of mass destruction. So what I want to do is talk a little bit about the dynamics of the triangle. The causal arrows go both ways. So I'm arguing here that capitalism fuels climate change and other forms of environmental destruction, but that also kicks back and creates a more toxic form of capitalism as it deals with the disaster. What Naomi Klein, the journalist and political analyst, has called disaster capitalism. So the disasters of the climate and the environment produce a more, destructive form of capitalism, and the spiral keeps going as they interact. And the same is true. Environmental climate change fuels militarism in really important ways, and militarism fuels climate change in really important ways. I think that's a relatively not widely understood and discussed dynamic, which is very important in looking at both climate change and militarism and the threat of extinction. And then the militarism that is caused by capitalism and acts back on capitalism is also central to the existential crises that we're facing. Now, I think what I want to do, particularly since many of you are focused on climate change and environmental issues, is spend a little bit more time describing the part of the triangle that goes between capitalism and climate change. And the reason I want to focus on that is that I'm not sure if this is true in your thinking and work in Taiwan and the theater there, but in the United States and the West, I think that the understanding of climate change and the structural roots of climate change in capitalism are very poorly understood. And I think that happens because the people who, the capitalist elites, and I'm thinking of people like Bill Gates, who talk a lot about climate change and solutions to climate change, advance an idea which is very seductive and which has come to dominate much of the discussion about how to deal with climate change, both in the government, in corporations, and even in climate change movements against climate change. I think it's a really sort of dangerous way of thinking, which is guiding us away from any kind of genuine solution to the climate crisis. And what I'm talking about, and I think of Bill Gates as somebody who kind of highlights this. Bill Gates is often seen as a capitalist, one of the world's richest men, who is very focused on climate change and wanting to, solve the climate change problem. And what Gates argues, and this is kind of captured liberals in the United States and even more progressive climate change movements by young people and left organizations in labor, is the idea that what we want to get to is what Gates calls green capitalism. And the idea behind that is the idea that what's fueling environmental destruction and climate change is the wrong technology. And the argument is that if we simply are able to shift over from carbon fueled technology, the technology of the energy of fossil fuels, of oil and gas, and cars and other, emitters of carbon and so forth, that if we rapidly embrace a new green technology, we'll solve the climate change issue. Now, this is a very seductive argument, and it's not entirely wrong, although ultimately it's very misleading in my view. It speaks in the United States to a very seductive philosophy, which is America is very technologically oriented. And so whenever major social problems emerge, really major crises like climate change, the tendency is to look for technological solutions, which is what the Bill Gates and the green capitalist kind of solution suggests. It suggests that we don't need to think about the almost impossible task, in their view, or an undesirable task of changing the economic system, or dealing with some major change in capitalist logic and governance. And because capitalism is actually, in the green capitalist story, a facilitator of the solution. Capitalism is seen as the great, as the system that best generates technological innovation and best harnesses change that can be driven by new technology. So the green capitalist story essentially is saying that actually the triangle that I'm suggesting here is wrong. that capitalism is not the cause of environmental destruction, it's the solution to environmental destruction, because capitalism is the system that can most rapidly develop the new green technology and create the green economic capitalist system that will ultimately save us from climate change. So while this extinction triangle may look familiar, it's not taking root in the large sectors of the population who will think a lot about climate change. Of course, there are large parts of the American population and political system that simply deny the existence of human-caused climate change. And we'll talk more about that when I get to the politics of dealing with change. But among the people in the United States who do take climate change as a serious threat, they've become, embedded in this capitalist story that the solution lies in technological change that can be generated quickly by capitalism. Now, I want to say that, of course, I don't dispute the importance of technology. I'm not trying to argue that technology is irrelevant or that we don't need substantial technological change to deal with the climate crisis. So I see when Bill Gates makes arguments as a representative of the capitalist class for green capitalism, I'm willing to say, let's adopt some of these technological changes in the energy system and in the infrastructure and in the energy grid and the transportation system and the production system that can be addressed through technological change. So in that sense, it's a step in the right direction. But in another and perhaps more profound sense, I see this story as fundamentally moving us in the wrong direction, because it's diverting us from the fundamental need to deal with the elements of capitalism, whether it's green capitalism or not so green capitalism, that dooms the environment both ways. And what I mean by that is, I think, familiar to many of you, that Jim E has told me that many of you are interested in degrowth, and that's a major part of the story. Capitalism is a system sort of hardwired for growth and for removing checks or constraints on expansion globally and infinite growth, because growth, capitalism is not stable unless we've never seen an equilibrium model of capitalism that accepts no growth. Capitalism is by its nature, in my view, hardwired for endless growth. And therefore, whether it's green capitalism that is, generating growth, or fossil, carbon capitalism, either way, it's going to create environmental destruction. And the other elements that I'm sure you're familiar with, the emphasis that capitalism always produces on profit as a central focus, and therefore growth is central to maximizing profit, to expansion, constant expansion, taking over more and more wilderness, and mass consumption as a kind of essential cultural foundation of the capitalist system. Because if you don't have what Marx called the fetishism of commodities, like almost the sexualization or eroticism of buying things and living large, capitalism will begin to culturally implode. It depends on a population that is addicted to growth and participating in gaining more material wealth. And so in all these ways that I think most of you are at least familiar with this analysis, a green capitalism is not going to change the underlying elements of the capitalist system that are most dangerous to the environment. And so if you take seriously that concern, this triangle makes clear that there is not going to be a viable solution to the climate crisis without, I mean, we need technological change, absolutely. But more profoundly, we need major structural change in the economic system and in the political, in the corporations and the system of corporate power and money that controls our politics and guides government policy. So the lesson of the triangle is that it's easily to be seduced into technological and other stories that are going to keep guiding us into a more dangerous future. I don't think I have the time to go into great detail about the other parts of the triangle. I just want to emphasize two things, I think. First of all, that militarism has always been a part of Western capitalism, taking the form of colonialism. And in the neo-colonial and then post-colonial era, we're still seeing hegemonic forces in the United States primarily, and embodied in the Biden administration right now, highly militarized foreign policy that leads to confrontations, new Cold Wars with Russia and China, in all likelihood, a militarization of the Middle East, the Pacific theater, and so forth. And these are, again, endemic to capitalism. American militarism is basically a way in which American corporations secure foreign markets and resources and cheap labor and so forth. As one pundit has said, you can't have McDonald's without a McDonnell Douglas. The military undergirds and secures the profits of large corporations. The other thing I just want to add in the current context is that the danger of nuclear war and extinction is much less, in my view, based on first use, although that is a policy that both Russia and the United States have both said remains part of their nuclear strategy. But if you think about what's happening in the Ukrainian war right now in Europe, between Europe and the United States on the one hand, and supporting Ukraine against Russia. This conflict is extremely dangerous in terms of the possibility of nuclear escalation. The spread of tactical small nuclear weapons right on the Russian border, and the Russian willingness to, bomb nuclear power plants, and the sort of the loss of the firebreak, the fact that large conventional weapons are now nearly as dangerous as the smallest tactical nuclear weapons. It's easier and easier for countries like the United States and Russia to contemplate actually using nuclear weapons, small nuclear weapons, and I think there's a growing recognition that the Ukrainian war is particularly dangerous because it can easily escalate into a nuclear conflict, which of course would be a major existential threat to the survival of the planet. And some of the same dynamics are true in the Middle Eastern war going on right now, the conflict that could emerge between Iran and the United States. And not to mention the growing militarization of the Pacific theater, which you all are familiar with, and the possibilities of war war, which the United States has become extremely militarized in its thinking about the economic challenge of China and the risks of a U.S.-China war, possibly related to Taiwan, which obviously has great importance, partly because of the importance of the semiconductor industry. this is an issue I'm sure you're very familiar with and we may want to talk about. But I just think that when you focus on climate change and environmental destruction, it's a major mistake to not recognize the intertwining of climate change with militarism, because they're both systemically intertwined with the economic system and power. And I'll just add finally regarding the triangle that the relation between climate change and other forms of environmental destruction and militarism are very strong, and not most people who study climate change don't think that as much as they need to about the military, the ways in which militarism and war massively increase the climate threat. The Pentagon, the US military acknowledges that the Pentagon itself emits more carbon than any other institution in the world. And wars have historically been, I mean, in the 19th century, the rise of, oil in the Rockefeller family, really came in its own into World War I and World War II, where oil became, replaced other sources of energy as the primary and most efficient way of waging war. So the many links between climate change and militarism going both ways. Climate change, of course, also creates major new violent conflicts that include things like the genocide in Rwanda was probably a climate change driven force to some degree. Climate change, 60% of the world lives within 60 miles of an ocean or sea, and therefore, as the waters rise, as I know you all are aware, people are displaced. Millions and millions of people are displaced from low-lying areas and are going to be in conflict with each other to find inhabitable land. In a state like Florida right now, it's hard for many people, Americans living in Florida, to find insurance companies that are willing to insure their homes, because Florida is subject to such great environmental danger that it would be suicidal for many insurance companies to insure people's homes in many areas of Florida. So this is all to say that the triangle is, in my view, a sort of way of picturing a set of polycrises, interrelated, extremely severe emergencies that confront the world and require a massive political mobilization to deal with them. And so what I want to conclude with, I know I've probably already spoken too long, is simply briefly say that the prospects, we're facing an American election, and in both the United States and Europe, we're seeing the rise of a new political profile, which is, and this is going to be happening in the presidential election in the United States in November, which is going to be a conflict, a race between Trump and Biden, between the Republican Party and the Democrats, and also is reflected in recent European elections. And what's happening is we're seeing a new political polarization in which the far right, sort of a new 21st version of the fascism that we saw in Europe during the 1930s, is re-emerging in Europe, and with the rise of far right parties in, France and Germany and Italy, among others, Hungary, of course, and others. And the weakness of traditionally strong social democratic and left parties in these major European countries, which are becoming dominated by center policies of either center right or center left policies, which are far from capable of, challenging the ruling capitalist order that we need to deal with the triangle of extinction. But let me turn finally to the United States, where I'm, very immersed in writing about and thinking and engaging with the presidential election. And I wish I could be more optimistic. As you know, what we're seeing now is the rise of a extremely far-right, authoritarian, American neo-fascist Republican Party led by Trump, who is openly authoritarian, and a Democratic Party which is appears much more committed to democracy, but is not well centered and organized to deal with the extinction triangle for the reasons I'll briefly talk about. Let me just say that if we were to see the election of Donald Trump, which is about a 50-50, according to polls, possibility right now, this far-right movement is kind of a coalition of very big money, of the billionaires in the United States, large finance, Wall Street, private equity firms, billionaires are now funding Trump, and reflects a kind of familiar pattern where capitalist forces, when they're in trouble, ally with far-right, racially driven politics to bring white workers into coalition with themselves, with capitalist elites, rather than joining more oppositional forces that might threaten capitalist profits and rule. So Trump and the far right has a long history in the United States. The recent book that that was mentioned about Who Owns Democracy looks at the long history of the far right kind of neo-fascist racial kind of politics of caste, which are intertwined with the politics of class, where capitalism and fascism come together. If Trump wins, that's the coalition that we're going to be looking at, and it's a climate denying coalition. It's a complete rejection. Trump has said if he's elected, he'd be a dictator on the first day, and his first policy would be what he calls drill, baby, drill, meaning he would undo all the constraints on oil and fossil fuels and let them run completely unfettered as a way of presumably bringing the economy back to prosperity. He is also, of course, a dyed-in-the-wool capitalist who is happy to see this triangle operate fully. A short-term focus on profit maximization, and he's literally doing transactional deals, as you've probably read, where he's offered, for example, big oil and gas, among other large numbers of corporate elites. He's offered them, taking away all their taxes and regulations on them if they simply, give $1 billion to his campaign. He's been very open about it. So the triumph of Trump and the kind of authoritarian far-right capitalist coalition that he's building would be extremely dangerous, because it would perpetuate and intensify the operation of the triangle of extinction. Regarding the Democrats, Biden is known to have initiated some domestic economic reforms, including climate investments, infrastructure changes, and so forth, that seem like a first step toward what one might call the green capitalist stage. And that's, in the overall context, a bit of a hope, because the Democratic Party has been locked into the Reagan neoliberal capitalist revolution and unable to really contest it. So Biden has, on the domestic front, made a step in that direction. And he talks a lot about climate change and economic investments and technological changes that will help to begin solving climate. And it is a step, but for the reasons I mentioned earlier, it's not a solution, because Biden is a dyed-in-the-wool capitalist, and he is not interested in changing the fundamentals of the capitalist system, whether it's the growth, he's highly committed to maximum growth, maximum expansion, and as you know, the really deeply distressing militarism that's, exacerbating, the war in Gaza and the Middle East, and, going for maximalist objectives in Russia-Ukrainian conflict, not looking for a kind of compromise solution there that would end that war. So if Biden wins, and again, he's not the favorite right now, but he would be a better choice if you think about the triangle of extinction, but he wouldn't be a very good choice for the triangle of extinction because he's so highly committed both to militarized capitalism, which is the ultimate system pictured in the triangle of extinction and will continue to breed climate change and war. And the left movements are not very strong in the United States today, as they've declined in Europe as well. But as I was beginning to speak about with Chen Yu, there is a new movement of young people and the labor movement in the United States. It's emerged in the last year with the Gaza war and, major strikes led by the United Auto Workers, which are beginning to signal a kind of stronger social movement, against neoliberal capitalism and against militarism, and very much in the case of young people in support of drastic climate change solutions, although they don't fully understand the role of capitalism in the climate change story. But I think it's not a completely hopeless situation because we're seeing, generationally, as often happens, this happened in the 1999 Battle of Seattle, the anti-globalization movement that was developed by environmental and labor coalitions in the United States, and the Occupy Wall Street movement that about 12 years ago was another surge of anti-capitalist movement in the United States. And now we're seeing this anti-war labor organizing both in universities and in factories around the country that signal the possibility of a new wave of movements that actually would challenge the kind of capitalist roots of both climate change and war, militarism, and offer some hope that we can see the beginning of a way of addressing capitalism. Is not popular, I should say, in the United States. About 50% of Americans say they have a negative association when they're asked by pollsters about whether they have a positive or negative feeling about capitalism. And more than half of American young people say that they have a negative emotional association with the word capitalism and a positive association with the word socialism or social democracy. So there is reason to believe that popular movements, and there are progressives in the Democratic Party that are much to the left of Biden, people like Bernie Sanders, who ran against him in 2016. So I don't think that we need to give up on the hope in the United States of a change that would begin to address the triangle of extinction. At the same time, the possibility of a Trump win, and even a Biden win is simply not strong enough to deal with the urgency and the emergency of the extinction triangle. And the way I think about that is that, this emergency has been created by a global system and global actors, global corporations in search of global profits, willing to sacrifice life on the planet to maximize short-term economic and gains and wealth. And the only way to ultimately deal with this, since it is a global structural problem, designed by global actors is to mobilize a global international response through both international movements and international, countries coming together, particularly countries that are subjected, like in the global South, that have long been subjected to the control of capitalist elites in the United States and Europe, and which you now see in like situations like Gaza and Ukraine. You see the rise of international mobilization, partly through the United Nations, partly through international courts, the International Court of Justice and the International Criminal Court, and international, climate and labor groups that are beginning to forge ties across nations and across borders to deal with what is essentially a global problem. So I don't think the solution to the triangle of extinction is a national solution. It's a global solution, but any global solution rests on a kind of local to global politics. Global politics has to start at the local level and build up. And so global challenges to the economy, whether to growth or to militarism and so forth, they have to often begin in local communities, but they then have to be taken up by national governments and then taken up by regional and international bodies, including the very, most global organizations in the UN and in regional, parts of the global South, which you see now being quite active in trying to oppose the catastrophe that's occurring militarily in Gaza right now in the Middle Eastern war, and which is showing that there is a potential for international mobilization, a recognition that the United States is not the totally dominating or reliable power that it has been for many years in the service of, presumably in the service of a rules-based order. It's always has operated quite differently, and now very obviously so in its Middle Eastern war policy. And we're beginning to see the rise of, student movements all over the world, young people rising up against the horrors of what's happening in Gaza and the Middle East. And I think those same young people are going to be, making connections, not only around anti-war policy, but against the economics that are driving that policy, and certainly against the climate change perils that, all young people have to viscerally face. I mean, there are global extinction, anti-extinction movements of young people who are refusing to have children, and recognizing that they're not likely to be able to live out their lives because of either climate change or a potential, catastrophic war. And so I see the prospects of a kind of local to global movement that takes on this triangle of extinction and begins, it's going to be piecemeal. It's not going to happen fast enough. There's going to be a lot of loss and tragedy, inevitably. But there is also the possibility of this resurgent movement, which is going to be driven by a desire to deal with the structural, nightmare and emergency that capitalism is producing, both through its economic policies, its environmental, destruction, and its military destruction. So I want to leave you, I'm sorry to go on so long, I want to leave you just with the idea that, it's a very, very, probably an unprecedented emergency crisis that the world has never encountered. So it requires an unprecedented global emergency response. And it's a major challenge, but it's not one that's totally impossible. It's one that I can imagine we can see hope for in the near future. So let me stop there, and I'm looking forward to any questions and conversation we can have.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
I'll stop sharing so that I can see if anyone want to ask a question. You can, if you want to ask a question, you can either just turn on your mic, or there's a hand sign at the bottom of the screen. You can use that, click on that, and I'll see that you have a question to ask. I think I'll start asking the first question. I think that it's probably a spectrum regarding the extent that people understand how bad it is, because some people just don't know, and there are people who it's inconvenient for them to really look into it. They may have a feeling that something's wrong, but it's really inconvenient. And then there are people who know and who are taking actions. I think for most people, it's inconvenient to really look into it. It's because nearly every one of us is a hostage. The system is very good at making us hostage, making us dependent on what they have to offer, what the capitalists like Bill Gates, they want to make us for us to make a living. They want us to depend on the track they have set there for us. So it's for if we want to be activists, how do we don't even show up on people's radar screen. And when you start talking about this, people just tune out. How to change that? I think it's particularly probably more so in Taiwan, I think, because, for instance, as if you're an environmental group in Taiwan, there's nearly no chance that you can talk about war. You can talk about the emissions from all the airplanes, all the weapons, all the explosions, because 2 years ago, Nancy Pelosi visited Taiwan, and after that, every single day, there are a lot of airplanes from mainland China and then our airplanes. Every day I hear the airplanes and I think about the emissions. But if you're an environmental group, you begin to talk about this. It's almost suicidal because you will lose your donations. It's a taboo. You cannot question the idea that China wants to. I think this is also part of the capitalist trick that they use. They fan nationalism and they fearmonger. They make it feel like it's all necessary. All these spendings on weapons and all these emissions that nobody know how much actually we emitted through the airplanes and warship and the weapons that we buy and the US produce. So it's just such a big taboo. And then the other example is the CEO of a huge chip manufacturing company called NVIDIA. The CEO just came to Taiwan. And it's also a taboo to talk about the kind of AI vision that he has or the big tech have. That vision is so contradictory to our survival. They want to build more factories here in Taiwan. We neither have the water that they need nor the energy. So, but if you begin to question AI or why do we need to produce so many chips, then again you fall back into that taboo, that question. We just need to be more, people will say we just need to be more competitive. And also people's jobs are linked to those kind of actions, and people don't really have choices. So many people, their jobs are linked to now even weapons manufacturing, because in the military industrial complex, they are very good at spreading their jobs even cross states, cross this voting districts, and now even crossing the borders to spread them to other countries, so that people's jobs depend on help manufacturing weapons. So my question is, with all those kind of, it's really a hostage situation. So how, as an activist, when we want to persuade people, how do we address that question? Because their jobs, they need to make a living, and they cannot talk about climate change. They don't have the luxury to talk about climate change, as, for example, as I do, because my job does not depend on that. So what do we do?
Yeah. Well, do you have about a year to talk? I mean, that's a very profound issue, and I see it every day in students that I work with, and people in the United States. It's very true. People are afraid. Their lives are locked into the system that's causing the problem, their jobs, their sense of well-being. Because universities teaching, going to I teach at Boston College, a university in Boston, which costs about $100,000 a year. So the students are just feel they have to devote their life to Wall Street and to big companies to make a lot of money. But they come to my classes, and there's something underneath all of the competitive job, career, competitive pressures that you're correctly describing, which are keeping them passive. Underneath that passivity is there's something gnawing. There's something wrong that these young people are feeling. And in classes where there's space for conversation of this kind, they are morally and personally deeply troubled by so much. As I said, Americans, who seem even the more authoritarian far right, they hate the role of big money. They realize that, Wall Street and big tech and other, the military industrial complex are all profiting off of their souls and their lives. So you're absolutely right that we're hostages, and most people are caught in the ideological kind of web that keeps people passive and quiet. And the repression is both cultural and physical. When people protest and so forth, there's been very violent repression of the activism. At the same time, if you look at what's happening, for example, to the wave of student protest around Gaza, which is beginning to grow into a larger focus on American war making and militarism, and is also connected to labor, because the major union that's now organizing graduate students and adjunct faculty who are losing security and so forth on campuses is the United Auto Workers. It's the same union that is been organizing manufacturing workers who are feeling, displaced by globalization in Michigan and Pennsylvania. Well, in California and Massachusetts, where there are large amounts of academic centers, the same union organizing workers in the Rust Belt are now organizing students and faculty in academic centers. So, and to go back to my story about the personal experience of people, people are complex, just like the problem. So you're right that they're hostages, and they're kind of locked into a very tight repressive system. But at the same time, the system is required to maintain credibility. It's required to maintain certain openness of civil liberties and speech, which happen to some degree on campuses. So when they come into classes with people like me, there's something to touch deep inside these people are very uncomfortable at some level with the idea of living a life for Wall Street or simply for profit. They don't feel good about that life. And when we talk at some, and they know that climate change is real, they realize these problems are no longer quite so abstract. I mean, in Boston today, which is a Northeast American city, before summer, we're seeing 100-degree all week. It's been 100 degrees. Nobody's been able to walk outside, and there's been a lot of people getting ill from the heat. And there's right after COVID, which has affected people so personally, there's a new rise of a new bird flu, which is absolutely predicted because of the way the economic system, pandemics are, of course, I deal with this in Dying for Capitalism, are part of the environmental crisis. And that's very personal. And people are recognizing their health and their future is all, and their moral, their souls are all intertwined with the repressive web of economic seduction and capitalist appeal that's governing so much of their life. So they're conflicted. And the role of activists is to speak to those contradictions that people are experiencing. I don't think it's true to say that you can't, at least in the United States, it's not that you can't speak to these issues. I speak to them every day with large numbers of students and young people and others. And people are always highly receptive. That's not because I'm so articulate. It's because people inside, at deep levels of their humanity, are suffering. They're conflicted. They're tormented. They know that they're not going to live good lives if they live purely for, making money and material growth and so forth. They know that. So there's space in the lives and thinking of many, many people who have bought into capitalism, but also hate the capitalist system. They hate super majorities of Americans on both the right and the left say that big money, whether it's from big tech or private equity or Wall Street, is destroying the world. They hate big money. And many of them are attracted to Trump because they believe that Trump is going to drain the swamp, as he said, is going to go after this big money. Now, of course, he's never going to do that. But the fact that there are so many people who follow him is just a little signal that millions of people, both conservative as well as more liberal and progressive or radical, are deeply disturbed about the condition of the world. They know that climate change is real. They know the economy is dehumanizing and exploitative, and they're looking for answers. And you get these waves, these unexpected waves, like we're seeing now with the labor movement and the student anti-war movement, which would not happen but it's touching that part of people's lives, which they know there's something deeply wrong. They really know it. Their mental health is affected. When you talked about AI, the Surgeon General of the United States just put out a public health warning for social media because young people's mental health is at risk. They're putting in now public health warnings on social media for parents, for children to watch how much social media, because the Surgeon General is saying it's a major public health crisis and mental health crisis. And young people I talk to who spend 5 hours a day on social media are scared of social media. They don't trust it. They feel it's putting them in competition with each other in ways that's separating them and isolating them and creating anxiety and depression personally for them. So while you're right that it's a massive repressive system economically, militarily, and culturally, there are spaces that the system has to leave open to raise and provoke challenges. And the responsibility of, I think, of those of us who have, like you and like I, who have the economic privilege to raise these questions, have the responsibility to be simultaneously extremely committed to activism and change, and to seize the opportunities that really do exist to help make these changes. And I don't want to be Pollyannish or say it's easy or even probable, but it's possible. And we have to act on that possibility.
Thank you. Is there any question from the audience? Not yet. I'm going to follow up on. Yeah, I see what you just said, but at the same time, I feel scared because of the fascism, the neo-fascism that you also talk about.
Mm-hmm.
When the ruling elite sense that that people are understanding, people are realizing what's going on, the election in Europe, not only do laborers connect cross countries, but the ruling class and also the far right, I think they make connections cross borders as well, because the rise of far right in Europe, also they have connection with people like Steve Bannon and Mike Pence.
Right.
It feels like while we are awakening to realize that we need to have solidarity, they completely understand what's going on, and they it's almost like it's their mask off moment. So they are showing their fists, the way not only in the US but in Europe, the way they crack down on protests. It's very, and Gaza itself, it's really very scary. So it's not pessimism. It's just I understand that we must mobilize and try to connect with each other and continue on talking about being activists. But time-wise, the power are in their hands, and now they understand. Because also, I would say this because also when we look at the refugees, the asylum seekers, the migrants, it's almost as if the ruling class, their only climate policy has long been, this may have been over a decade, their sole climate policy has long been just to militarize borders, militarize law enforcement. So that's their policy, and it's getting more and more obvious. They don't intend to hurt the profits of big oil at all, or any big emitters, but they are just committing, whether it's in Europe or in the United States, they are committing more and more money to border law enforcement. So that's just a very scary, it's very dystopian picture. And is there still time are we going to it's like a race of time, us versus them. And it doesn't look very good from what I can see.
Yeah. Well, I agree with you. I mean, it's the far right and the authoritarian kind of, they flourish in crisis because people are scared, and the solutions they seem to offer, which are, as you say, based on fear, which they've helped create, is very seductive and very persuasive. But as I say, I mean, if you look at this is not an entirely the existential, magnitude of the threats is unprecedented, but the nature of the politics you've been describing is not at all new. We have a long history. I mean, the United States, it has from the very beginning, had a neo-fascist. Hitler got a lot of his race theory from the American South, German eugenicists and fascist thinking. Hitler himself wrote that the inspiration for much of his fascist thinking came from America. So America, from its very beginning in the slave conditions of the South, and then in the Jim Crow regimes of the post-Reconstruction era in the 19th century, has long had this right-wing authoritarian, movement, which has often been in the in the 30s in the United States was often linked with capitalist Republican. Henry Ford and the DuPonts, major capitalist figures in the 30s, were fascists, and they were linked with America First kinds of politics. So, and at the same time, you had a progressive New Deal kind of, and some populism, progressive populism in the Gilded Age under Rockefeller and J.P. Morgan. So if you look, and I do give this long historical outline in the recent book called Who Owns Democracy, where this is not a new political conflict that you're describing. And when you look historically, you realize that it's not all doom and gloom, that there is very powerful, if you look at how these, I think the best way to understand these things is see how they developed historically and how they were resolved. And what you see is there have long been these very powerful capitalist, neo-fascist coalitions, which have gained power in certain periods, but then have been overcome by mass mobilizations from progressive labor, student, minority, women. They're just all kinds of historical patterns of resistance, which show historically that a view that the system will simply cripple and dismantle any possibility of mobilization is simply not true of history. The history that I write about in this book on democracy shows that there's long been exactly the kind of polarization between the far-right populist capitalist coalition and a more progressive politics. Now, I agree the left politics today is particularly weak, but we're beginning to see, as we've talked about, a new wave of potential, what I would call left populism, real mobilization against ruling financial, oil and military power. So I guess I share your view that it's a scary situation because the threat is so urgent and so great. We've never faced threats so extreme before, where the future of life is at stake. But in terms of the dynamics of the politics, they're not particularly new. We are just seeing the most recent version of a long, long struggle. And that history is not entirely hopeless. We've seen a lot of progress during parts of that struggle, which is worth recognizing, because if you're going to keep being activists, you need to know the history of triumph as well as loss and the hope that has been achieved, the solutions that have been advanced and partially won. So there's a history of winning on many of these political contests that are similar to what we're dealing with now. And I think the history, which is always the best guide to what we can expect, suggests that there are these possibilities of change, really major structural change. And when we study how people are thinking and personally, when we deal with young people on these issues or working people, we see these possibilities that we've seen play out in history. There are many major historical populist uprisings in American history against this kind of neo-fascist capitalist dynamic that have gained certain goals and created new rights and new powers for these movements. And so I think we could be on another stage of advancing that long historical struggle. You can't separate yourself from the long struggles that have been, when I was a student, I went to Mississippi. I was almost killed there. And that was a civil rights struggle that Martin Luther King was leading. And then he said, you can't fight against the violence against Black people in America when America is killing people all over the world. He said, civil rights has to be linked to American militarism and ending American wars. And then, he was killed himself when he joined the strike of garbage workers who were in Nashville, Tennessee, and when he marched on a labor strike. So I think King is a good example of an inspiring figure. He wasn't crazy radical, but he really managed to sort of deal with all elements of the Extinction triangle. He understood the economic problems of poverty and how it was tied all into race. But he saw racial and civil rights struggle as related to a larger democratic struggle. And so I think you're seeing a reawakening of that today. I think my own early experience, my own personal history, both in civil rights, anti-war organizing, labor organizing, teaching and writing around the world on these issues, has made me, in my own history, keeps intensifying my centrality of people learning this history and realizing how important understanding these historical struggles are. That's why I wrote this recent book on the history of democracy in the United States, because it's a tragic story, but it's also a hopeful story in certain ways. So I just would go back to the idea that there's not a philosophical solution here. It's a question of understanding our history and living up to the lessons of that history that we should be learning.
And any tips about how to connect people in their silos, especially at a digital time? You talk about labor and the anti-war movement right now in the U.S. It's and the United Auto Worker and the Palestine Solidarity. Are they also connected with environmental groups?
Yes. I think
they are already.
They are already, yeah. I mean, these are new movements, but I mean, the Gaza movement is new, so we don't know how it's going to evolve. But the same young people who are, out on the campuses in tents protesting Gaza are, they're talking about organic food and a different kind of, they're trying to ensure that the protests are environmentally sustainable. And I just think this stuff is in the bloodstream of people today. And so there's a kind of natural way in which these things are connected. I do feel, I wrote another book that's just coming out in the spring, which is dealing with these same issues. It's called Bonfire. And it looks at how important the connections between people and movements are, that AI, social media is isolating people. Capitalism functions as a system to very individualistic, very self-centered, to divide people from each other and break down solidarity and communities of whether it's in the workplace where people are dispersed by, into remote and, we don't have a collective workplace. Communities are being broke down. This new book I've done, which will come out in the spring, is about how this whole system functions by breaking apart the connections and relationships among people, which creates massive social isolation, anxiety, depression, and breaks down movements. Movements arise when people are able to build connections with each other. And I think what you're seeing with these young people today is the beginnings of reaching out. And despite all the, I write a good deal about the dangers of social media and of AI and so forth, but there are also connecting forces where online connections can be translated into offline activism and movements. I've been always struck in recent years by how good young people are at mobilizing, organizing meetings, getting people together within an hour on campus, because they're able to reach so many people online, and they're so skilled in using their phones at rapidly bringing people together for and have agendas already worked out for meetings and so forth. So I think the issue you're raising about connections between people and movements is very important, and we have to be very wary of the technology and the social media and so forth, but we also have to be able to use it to our own advantage. And these movements globally are connecting with each other through, just like we're talking across, very long distance. Our conversations are being replicated by movements and young people all over the world. Most of my students have connections all over the world and talk to young people in Europe and in the global South. So I don't want to romanticize this, and there are extreme dangers of social media, but the kind of connecting force which is central to activism and to movements is in some way going to be empowered by people who understand both the dangers and the possibilities of these new technologies. But the key to activism is overcoming the isolation, despair. I mean, discouragement, giving up always happens when people are cut off from other people and don't feel they have a community of people that they can rely on and will support them in common, pleasures and common struggles. And the system is very good at dividing people and forcing them into competition with each other. And unfortunately, left movements in their siloed identity politics have played into this, separating different groups, different racial groups compete with each other. Asian Americans compete with Black Americans, compete with Hispanic Americans. That's the real danger of identity politics. And so we have to form our movements away from these siloed kinds of politics into what I call this universalizing resistance, which deals with the ultimate economic and political, structures which are, oppressing and creating problems for all these different siloed groups and ordinary people. So much of my work is about how you build away from this fragmented identity politics, which divides people. They end up competing with each other for the scraps that the economic elites are prepared to offer people, and instead come together to challenge collectively, multiracially, across gender, racial, and other divisions, to come together to deal with the triangle and the overall systemic forces that are repressing all of these groups, So that's another strategy. You have to be much of my work is a critique of the left because it's enabling the rise of the right is largely, I think, the success of the far right has been the abdication of the left of a kind of its own class-based populist struggle. And when you have hard times, this is yet the struggle of another book I'm just working on right now, it generates populist politics. And if the left doesn't have its populist politics in place, populism meaning a politics that unites people against ruling elites. And there's a long history of populism, both left and right in America. And right in recent times, since Reagan, the populism has come from the right, which has a long history in America, and their success has been the failure of the left to sustain its own forms of populism. If the left abandons class-based politics and populism for siloed identity politics, you are going to see the left is empowering far right, because far right populism will always win in the absence of left populism. So the left that abandons a populist struggle is turning over victory to the right in the name of opposing it. Biden and the left is defending much of American institutions, and in so doing is failing to recognize the need. I mean, the power of the far right is partly that it has made itself the challenger of the system. People who are unhappy, and most people are unhappy, are saying, oh, we like Trump and the Republicans because they are going to fight the system. They are saying we're going to overthrow the system. And the left, in the name of protecting against insurrection from the right, is actually empowering the right by becoming the party of defending the establishment, saying we have to defend American economic and military institutions against these insurrectionists on the right. So there's this very odd politics emerging around right-wing populism, which is a form of 21st century fascism, being empowered by the failures of the left and its abandonment. This happened, by the way, also in Europe during the fascist periods of the 30s, where the left collapsed in internal divisions and, the breakdown of the kind of active solidarity across large parts of the progressive left, socialist, labor community, which just opened the door to the success of Hitler and Mussolini and the fascist right. So there are a lot of historical lessons to be learned from that period in history as well, both in Europe and in the United States.
But the real left also has the real problem of not having as much money, nearly as much money as the right.
Yes.
For example, yeah, that's a very, especially now with all sorts of campaign online, also sorts of social media and AI manipulation. The left is, without the money, they're just defenseless. And if you look at the independent media on the left, they're just begging for money every single day. They need donation. And the right, they just use high tech, they use algorithm, and they use all sorts of smear campaign to try to defeat the left independent media and candidate. Like the UK Labour Party, there was this smear campaign against Jeremy Corbyn, and it was extremely successful. So it's really difficult and how to overcome that. You just don't have, it's not possible for the left to have the kind of money that the far right.
Yeah, but again, you can look at history again. The left is always, the right is always got money. And yet you have, I mean, this is not new. And yet you have a history of, left populist groups without a lot of money who have historically made major gains. In the Depression in the United States in the 30s, you had, the rise of a labor movement which had no money, no jobs. And the right, the capitalist elites had all the money, but you had a successful, it wasn't a revolutionary challenge to capitalism, but it was a successful challenge to the kind of deregulated capitalism of the 20s and the Gilded Age, which was carried out by people without a lot of money. They were people without jobs, people for the first time organizing wildcat strikes and, takeovers of factories. I mean, ultimately, mass popular power can do a lot of good without needing the money that, that you think of as totally, which does, of course, carry enormous power. It's kind of interesting that Trump is not, he's now begging for money from billionaires because his campaign has not been raising the amount of money that you would expect. Now he's now going to get a lot of it from the capitalist class, who's beginning, as they did with Hitler, they feel they can control Trump, and so they're beginning to give him money. But that money does not ensure that the far right or the capitalist right coalition will win, because masses of people have turned against big money and they just don't like it and they feel it's destroying their lives. So you're right that money plays a hugely critical role and keeps the system, well oiled and in power. But history again teaches us that groups without money can make major change.
Good, very important reminder. Make me feel more hopeful.
Yeah, I mean, I think history is really important to all this whole conversation. And I think that, we live in a very ahistorical period. People don't know history. The activists, the non-activists, nobody knows history. My students don't know any history. So that's why I spend a lot of time. I think all of these problems we've been talking about have long climate change has a long, important history. In Dying for Capitalism, as I say, it's tied to the development of, capitalism could have been run by water power and was initially in England. And it's very interesting to look at how it moved to coal and then to oil, as I said, through militarization and so forth. But these historical lessons are very important in seeing how what appear to be impossible crises, in the past, people have found ways to make some progress. So I just would say, the historical narrative is just and the lessons we can draw from history are very, very important. But I don't mean to gloss over the pessimism. I mean, you're pointing to very real problems that are overwhelming, and we're going to be lucky if we can get through and make real, save the world from these emergencies that we're confronting. It's a very, very challenging time.
Yeah, I think the thing that's new, that's different from history, is the climate ticking clock. It's the entire planet.
Yeah, I agree with that.
Right on the track of becoming uninhabitable. I think I just read that the other day.
Yeah. I know among climate experts, which I'm not, but when I read their work, there's a wide spectrum of people. Some who say it's all over, there's no hope at all, and others who say there's still hope for solutions. So the people who technically know most about this subject in terms of the physics of the climate, I think are not in total agreement about. I mean, they all agree we're in a dire emergency, but the level of possibility of solutions is still not known. Shenli, tell me, why are people not part of this conversation? Are we not speaking to their concerns, or why are people quiet?
I'm not sure.
Oh, okay.
Are there any questions from the audience? I don't know why people are so quiet. But part of the problem might be language. But I will put as I always do, I will put up Chinese subtitle to the video that I will put online. But
how many people
are there
how many people are in the audience right now?
Right now, 26.
Oh my goodness! And
including you and me.
Oh my God, I feel terrible that they're silenced and they have not been able to voice their concerns.
Anyone want to ask question? Well, but that's also part of our culture sometimes. People are more timid and quiet.
Yeah. She said, I'm quiet because
I see.
Oh, yes.
Oh, someone posted. Did you see?
Yes. And somebody raised their hand. Maybe you can ask them to speak.
Okay. Hi, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm Sophia. I have a question regarding the extinction triangle. So I saw how it's all the relationships are intertwining. I'm curious how, if you could elaborate on how capitalism could possibly help alleviate climate change.
Well, remember, my whole analysis was that capitalism, in my judgment, will never solve climate change. That even if you move in the Bill Gates green capitalist direction, did you hear my discussion of that? Where I talked about Bill Gates and the problems?
I did. So there are in your belief, there are no ways that it could, in the capitalistic society that we have right now, help try to alleviate the climate change situation.
I think we can make important reforms. I mean, I think what Gates and other green, capitalists are advocating, and Gates is putting a lot of money behind it, are changes in towards solar and wind and public transit and so forth, things that will make a difference. So I'm not hopeless about the idea that there's a kind of green capitalist near-term possibility, which will be a step in the right direction. But I don't know what you think, Sophia, but my own view is that the fundamental profit forces underlying capitalism, in terms of the growth, the commitment to growth in order to maximize profits, the financial markets that run on very short-term imperatives, and basically all the climate change is basically in a capitalist system a kind of massive externality that capitalism, what capitalism runs on are what economists call externalized costs, sometimes externalized benefits. But climate change is basically a set of environmental costs that the producers do not have to bear. They export it, externalize it to the larger society. So I think that's just the fundamental reality of capitalism. And so I think while we can make some progress under capitalism, and capitalism is not the only system that generates climate change. I mean, socialism, growth-oriented socialism, I mean, can be, you see around the world, other, systems which are also heavily either coal-driven or fossil fuel-driven. So I'm not saying capitalism is the only source, nor am I saying that you can't have some benefits from green capitalism. But I don't think that capitalism, when you're basically, you would need such a profound change in consumerism, in growth, in, in agriculture, in the way capitalism operates financially and productively, that I think you're never going to be able to create a sustainable future in the long term in a capitalist order. But what do you think, Sophia?
I agree with you. I was just wondering if there's maybe another way to see it. So hence
Yeah.
I raised the question. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I'm not trying to, my view is that the crisis is so, it's such an emergency. You grab on to every possible change you can break. The French ecologist André Gortz once made a distinction that I think is useful for activists between what he called radical reform and reformist reform. By reformist reform, he meant changes which lock you in to the system that's causing the problem, reforms that basically bolster the existing system. By radical reform, he meant non-revolutionary change which actually open the door to further change. So I guess from his perspective, you could ask the question, is green capitalism a radical reform or a reformist reform? In other words, as you embrace more of Gates's technological and green capitalist initiatives, then do you open the door to a much deeper change in the economic and political structure that would really come to terms with the growth problem and the commodification issues and so forth? And I think it's possible. It might be, actually, Sophia, I'm glad you raised this question because as I'm thinking about it more, like from this Andre Gortz position, I think it's possible that green capitalism might be a kind of radical reform. In other words, a step which might open up larger changes in capitalism, which lead toward a real solution. On the other hand, I worry that the green capitalism puts so much focus on the merits of capitalism as a technological fountain of, gold, that it actually will divert people. Why would a person like Bill Gates, and he just is a symbol for all of the many corporations and capitalists who are committed to this green capitalist ideology. I think the danger there is that they're using green capitalism as a kind of reformist reform. It's a way of making change that does some good, but locks you in to the system that's ultimately causing the underlying problem. So, I think your question is sort of interesting and important because it leads you to ask the question of how should activists relate to these green capitalist initiatives, and can they find ways of using them to create more leverage and change, and to break through what we've been talking about, the passivity of the population, to sort of help that these green technological changes will engage ordinary people, affect their lives, and say, yeah, now we can do this and we have to do more. So I think it's an open question in some ways about whether these reforms and these technological changes can actually open up a new, more powerful current of change, or whether it will lock us further into the structural trap that we're in right now. But Sophia, thank you for asking that question. It's really important.
Thank you.
I'd love to hear from anybody else who might have questions or thoughts or rebuttals of what I have to say.
Can you see the chat
Yeah,
room? There is
I saw
someone
one
put a
chat.
message.
Yeah, I saw one chat, but just one. I'm not seeing. Can you read me a chat that's there?
It's from Jess. Do you want to ask yourself, or should I read it? Jess. Okay. She wrote, I'm a PhD candidate in literature from National Taiwan University. Thank you for the fascinating talk. I'm wondering if not capitalism, what might be the alternative? I read an anthropologist, Dascola Philippes' work on critiquing capitalism, and he related the issue to the problem of Western or Enlightenment concept of subject.
Interesting. Well, it's the great, and one of the great questions, because, capitalism has become such a dominant, culturally, economically, politically. It's very hard for people. People are unhappy with capitalism. I've said in America, interesting, the most capitalist country, the fiercest capitalist country, people have a negative association with capitalism in America. So it's important to say, well, is there an alternative? What does it look like? And in the Dying for Capitalism book, where I lay out the triangle of extinction, we use the historical model of abolitionism in America, where slavery was seen as the only, for thousands of years, humans had lived with slave systems. And here was a new movement in the United States saying we can abolish slavery. And people didn't believe it. They said, you're utopian, you're dreamers. But the history of abolitionism showed that you could pull together many different constituencies with many different, it involved a lot of cultural. There were novelists who were writing about it, photographers, picturing the slave system, radicals, centrists, who came together and helped to build an abolitionist movement in the United States, which had the impossible dream of ending slavery, and actually led in that direction to actually, ending slavery in America. So I think that same model can be applied to your question about capitalism. You might say, well, for the last, 500 years, capitalism has simply grown and expanded, and there's no viable alternative. It's impossible to imagine an alternative. But what we argue in the book, following the, we need a kind of new abolitionist movement, which is a movement to abolish the existing economic structures, which are so dangerous for humanity, both because of their economic inequality and poverty that they raise, as well as, of course, their great environmental and military costs. And so what we come to in the book is the idea of, there are many ways to do this, but we basically need to move from a system of private commodification, where everything is made for sale on the market. Commodities are simply sales on the market, to what do we call a public goods economy. What we mean by that is, and you see some actual development of this in countries in Europe, for example, during parts of the 20th century, where the societies moved away from pure commodity production, pure sale for everything on the market, which is what neoliberal capitalism says. It says everything should be privatized. Even children should be bought and sold on the market. I mean, you have these extremes. And we say, no, as in the family and with children, there are a lot of things that should not be bought and sold as commodities on the market. For example, healthcare and education and transit systems. Those have to be done created as public goods rather than as commodities for profit. You need, and what are public goods? They are goods and services that are produced by public bodies for the public interest. So you need either governmental production, and that doesn't have to be highly centralized government. It can be local and, regional governments, provincial governments. In Europe, for example, in Germany, you had large public goods production and services in after World War II when Germany was rebuilt, but a very small federal government. The money was all redirected out to the provinces and to the communities. But there are many ways to build a more public goods economy where health and education and other kinds of production, the whole housing, agriculture, food, gardens, land use is restructured around public interests and public community goods rather than private market commodity goods. So when I think about alternatives to capitalism, I think there are these things already in place. People like public social security systems. They like public gardens. They like, I was in Korea recently. They're crazy about public gardens. They love eating together out in parks and in, families go out and enjoy public space. Public space is important. Even in the United States, there are now gardens and, public parks being created inside large cities. And people, of course, desperately need public health services. And so even in a deeply capitalist country like the United States, you see the emergence of these public goods sectors, which can be expanded and grown into public financing, for example, public energy systems and so forth. So I think, again, it's not a utopian idea. You can look at various historically, the direction of the development of public goods production and services, which can be expanded ultimately into a very different system, which is rejecting the idea that everything should be bought and sold on the markets. It's just so completely dehumanizing, and moving toward a system which connects people and brings everybody together in services and goods which are produced in a way that can be servicing the well-being of everybody in the community rather than just people who are rich. But thank you for that question. It's really a very central issue about, if you're going to say capitalism is the heart of the extinction crisis, you've got to be able to talk at some length about how you envisage a different kind of economic system and how you create that new system. So your question is incredibly important.
Thank you. Yeah, I think most people think alternatives are like socialism, communism, and those are big words. And especially in Taiwan, it's also part of the taboo. So it's very hard to imagine what, if not capitalism, what else?
Well, from what you're saying, there's a lot of parallels between Taiwan and the United States. They're both locked into capitalist ideologies and systems, and it's very hard for ordinary people to think about what alternatives would look like. They don't know. But on the other hand, at least in the United States, I don't know if this is true of Taiwan, people are unhappy. They see the concentration of enormous amounts of money that's not helping ordinary people, and they feel there's some kind of basic unfairness about the way things are operating. Most people, about 60 or 70% of American working people say they're living paycheck by paycheck. They don't feel secure. They feel they could, quickly get into trouble, lose a job, have an illness, and lose their life in some, their livelihood. And so, even though I don't know how this works in Taiwan, but in the United States, it's a deeply capitalist society, but it brings all the problems that are very personal to people living in this system. So the very people who are being indoctrinated into capitalist ways of living and thinking are also suffering personally, and they know it from the way their life is being organized. So you have to kind of tap into that both economic and moral dissatisfaction and help people find connections with each other that can begin to build some kind of alternatives. And those are step-by-step alternatives. They don't emerge, all together all at once. They build up over a long period of rebuilding.
Yeah, I'm trying. Right now, it's just, I know people are unhappy, especially young people. Just
Right.
housing is a huge problem. It's not possible to buy, and the rents just go higher and higher each year. But
Yes.
at the same time, these people who are unhappy, who may have mental issues, at the same time, they also are very much into, like the CEO that I talked about, when there are big shot, a big company, big CEO comes to Taiwan, it's treated like a superhero. So they
Yeah.
also are fans of these very wealthy CEOs.
Well, I think people
maybe
are very
dreaming.
conflicted. They, like you say, they're subjected to a lot of propaganda. So they're dealing with cultural messages that are very seductive, and people in power
Yeah.
with a lot of money that are very glamorous, and they say, I want to be like that. But on the other hand,
Yeah.
the reality of their lives doesn't match up with that, and they know it, and they feel unhappy, and so you can speak to that, and it's a matter of, a lot of this is education, and a lot of this change happens with young people in education, and we have to try to keep fighting against. I've had to deal with repressive forces in universities, but I've been able to survive it and continue to do the kind of work I do. So I think it's possible, but it's hard work. You have to be really committed to it, and it can be emotionally and politically difficult to survive it, but you have to do it. And there's pleasure in it. When I think about my own life and where I've gotten my satisfactions, it's in maintaining the commitment to this kind of educating people, opening people's, speaking to people's private unhappiness and to how that is connected to their public, economic, society, and so forth. And maybe one way of thinking about this in Taiwan also is people are not going to be revolutionary, but you sort of lead them toward this kind of idea of radical reformism, this idea that you make changes that are possible now. And you look at what kinds of changes might open the door to future changes. Because once people are successful in making certain small changes in their lives or in the people around them, the communities locally, they're then going to become more believing in the possibility of making further changes. So, one small success builds on the possibility of making further success over time. And it's a lifetime of learning, I always think of activism and radicalism as kind of like peeling an onion. You keep peeling off layers of consciousness and seeing what's wrong. And you cry because when you peel an onion, tears come to your eyes. But over time, you begin to understand deep new things that are really important to your survival, emotionally and personally and socially. So I like to peel the onion.
Thank you so much. It's very, very inspiring, and it's very helpful for someone who's kind of feeling helpless and sometimes hopeless.
Right. I'm picking that up from you, and I understand it completely. So I want to talk to you. We should keep up a conversation because I want to keep you hopeful that some kind of real change is possible. I believe somebody like you and probably many of your colleagues there can make a real difference, but it's a real struggle. I understand it deeply to maintain hope in the possibility. So if I can serve a role in helping you hold on to some elements of that hope, I'm happy to do so.
Thank you so much. Any more questions from the audience? Okay, if not, thank you so much for this wonderful talk, and especially that the hope you bring to us, at least to me.
Yeah, well,
thank you so much.
I enjoyed it very much. Let's stay in conversation, and I hope you keep fighting and keep peeling the onion, so to speak, even when it
I
brings
will.
tears to your eyes. Yeah, good.
I
Okay,
will. Thank you so much.
take care. Yeah, very nice to
Take
talk to you.
care. Good night. Good night.
Bye. Bye,
Bye.
everybody. Bye.
Bye.